Hello there. Welcome to Blake's Anatomy. Today we're going to break down the anatomy of a layer in Photoshop and show you all the systems inside of it and how those systems work together to make that layer work. It's very similar to the human body. Now, I have to give you a little caveat here, a little disclaimer. I'm not a doctor, so everything you hear from me is probably going to be anatomy at a 3rd grade level. Okay, so all this dressing up for nothing. However, we can learn a lot about a layer in Photoshop by looking at the anatomy of the human body, and that's exactly what we're going to do in this episode of the Workflow Essentials. Dude, I'm totally telling you, this thing, it doesn't even have a heartbeat. It doesn't have a heartbeat. Okay. All right, Workflow Essentials episode 2. Otherwise known as Blake's Anatomy, or the anatomy of a layer in Photoshop. So let's do a little bit of a review first. In the last lesson, we talked about the various types of layers, and we kind of equated them to various different personality types. So it's very easy to remember these layers when we think about them in the form of personalities. Well, here, we're gonna take that from the personality level to the personal level and break down each one of these layers and see what happens in each one of them to make them do what they do. So we talked about the blank layer, the pixel layer, the adjustment layer, the layer mask, the vector mask, the smart object, and that awkward social gathering of the layer group. So layers in Photoshop are just like the human body. Now, they don't have bones, they can't chew food, they can't put that food in various places, but each layer has things that happen inside of it that allow it to do the things that it does when it's interacting with the layer's palette. So there's many systems in the human body, and these aren't all the systems, but these are the systems that we can relate to various parts of a layer so that we can better understand what it does. And those systems are the muscular system, the skeletal system, the nervous system, the circulatory system, and the integumentary system. Again, I said this is from a 3rd grade level, so I'm going to butcher a lot of this stuff. The muscular system in the human body is very similar to opacity. The opacity of a layer determines its strength. In Photoshop, though, all layers pretty much start out with an opacity of 100%. It's not the same way for us. We aren't born at 100% strength and then we lose it over time. We gain strength and we lose strength depending on how much we work out. I used to be a lot stronger than I am now, probably functioning at 50%. But a layer starts out at 100% and you can reduce the opacity so that it's not as strong or potent as it would be at 100%. The second system is the skeletal system, which I equate to fill, because fill is just like the skeletal system or the bones in our body. It dictates the brittleness of that layer, or in some cases, how the blend modes that are on that layer are going to interact with the image. So if you reduce the fill, you start to take away the bones from the body and the body would just fall to the ground. You take away the fill and you'll see in our demonstration that we're going to do how certain things are left behind and the whole image doesn't go away. And that's why the skeletal system and fill are very much the same. The third system, the nervous system. The nervous system is our main form of communication from our brain through the rest of our body to communicate to certain parts. And the same thing is true for blend modes. These little blend modes that you have of soft light, normal, overlay, those things are basically a communication device that's built into a layer that allows it to turn certain pixels on or certain pixels off, depending on how that blend mode is told to interact with all the other pixels below it. So it's very much a communication system, the blend modes are. And I think a lot of times people aren't very effective communicators. And I know that because I can see how often they use blend modes. It's a communication joke. The blend modes are really powerful. And once you learn all of the blend modes inside and out, that becomes an integral part of your workflow. Before I understood blend modes, I would do a lot of work on my photos, and then I found out about blend modes, and what I noticed was that I could use one layer with one blend mode combined with even opacity and fill, and I could do what essentially 5 or 6 layers would do normally on my layers palette to keep things clean and also keep them non-destructive. The nervous system here, or the blend modes, are imperative for you to understand in Photoshop. The next system is the circulatory system, or blend if. So the circulatory system is responsible for transporting certain materials throughout your body. Sometimes these systems get blocked. Now, that's a bad thing if you've got a heart blockage in your body. But with Blend If, by telling that layer to block certain areas off, you can really take control of your photos in Photoshop. And really, when I learned how to use Blend If and realized that it is the circulatory system of the layer that determines how functional that layer is, you can really do some interesting things with Blend If, especially on the restriction side of things. So blockages are good here when it comes to Blend If. And Blend If is part of layer styles, which is very much the circulatory system of a layer. The last one is the integumentary system, or the skin. So I had to Google this one, what integumentary was. I didn't even know that the skin system of our body was called the integumentary system. But the skin hides all the organs, veins, muscles, everything that's underneath our skin is basically hidden by that outer layer. So that outer layer, which we talked about in the last lesson, is very much like a mask. A mask in Photoshop is essentially the skin of that layer and what you can do to show that is underneath that layer. So, I think some people have a hard time with that white reveals and black conceals type thing. I find it easier to think about it as skin. So when I think of a mask as skin, and I say, okay, if I take away the skin on my hands, I'm going to see the muscle underneath it. So if I take away something from this layer, I'm going to see the layers underneath it. And that's the easiest way for you to remember how a layer mask works, is when you think about it as the skin layer of your human body. So let's go ahead and hop into Photoshop. We'll do some practical application. I'll break down each one of these systems and show you exactly what they do for each one of your layers in Photoshop. All right, so to demonstrate these different systems that you'll find in each different layer, I have a photo here from Yosemite. It's one of my favorite shots. It was just a random shot, just turned and looked in a different direction, and just, I liked the way everything was coming together. Nothing really iconic about it. I just liked the snow and I liked the clouds behind it, and I thought it was this really beautiful canvas. But I don't think that this image quite says what I wanted to say yet. So I need to use some of these systems and some of these layers in order to make this work. So what I'm going to show you here is first the muscular system, or the meat on the bones, opacity. So I'm going to go ahead and make a curves adjustment layer. And again, the curves adjustment layer, beautiful. Why? Because it's a global traveler, it can go anywhere, and it does a beautiful job of global edits. So I'm going to go ahead and drop the contrast in here a little bit. Look at that. That looks really nice when we start to drop that contrast. The way the curve works is right here. This is our darkest darks. Our lightest lights are up here, and our midtones in between. And I might bring that up a little bit there so it doesn't quite make those whites too contrasty. Before, after. Now, there's a couple ways that I can control this. I think it's a little too much. I think it's a little too powerful. And what we say about strength? Well, to reduce the strength of something, we go right here to opacity, and we can reduce the opacity, which then reduces the strength of the curve without actually modifying the curve. See how this system works? The way this system works, or the way this application or property, whatever you want to call it, works in Photoshop, it's the strength of the layer. It's how strong that layer is and how it communicates with the things underneath it. By reducing the opacity to 50%, we're only telling this curve to apply half of its power to the underlying areas. Opacity is a pretty easy one to wrap our head around. Fill is a little bit more difficult, because you see fill right here. Fill's right here. If I drop it, what's it doing? Well, if we don't have a certain blend mode selected here, and we aren't working with like a type or text or anything like that, because fill is actually the skeletal strength. Let's do this. I'm going to press T for type tool. I'm going to type Yosemite here. Okay. Make all of that white. Again, this isn't really part of the workflow demonstration, just showing you how this works. I'm going to use one of my favorite, Bebas. Where are you? Where are you, Bebas? There you are. My favorite. Press Control T and make this larger. Okay. So we make this larger right about there. Oh, look at that. It's a postcard for Yosemite. I'm going to double click on this thing where it says Yosemite here. And these are the layer styles. So basically, without going too deep into it, I can make this a drop shadow on the text. We'll make that drop shadow pretty big and with a big spread and a big size. Now you might not be able to see that drop shadow yet, but let's do this also. Let's make a bevel and emboss. We'll make that bevel depth pretty big. We'll make that size pretty big. Okay. So this is your gaudy old school postcard here with a bevel and emboss on there and a deep shadow. Now, If we drop the opacity on this Yosemite layer, look what happens. We lose the opacity of both Yosemite, the wording, and also the layer styles that are there. But the fill, and where I'm talking about the bone structure of this word Yosemite here, is if you drop the fill of this, it will reduce the white or the bone of that word Yosemite, yet leave the bevel and emboss and the drop shadow. So that's how fill works on certain types of layers. Typically on anything text-wise, this is how it's going to operate. What we need that for is we're going to need that for certain blend modes. There are certain blend modes that we're going to get into because the next is actually the nervous system or the communication or blend modes. Blend modes are how a certain layer is going to communicate with all the pixels underneath it. So let's make another curves adjustment layer here. And with this curve, let's do something like this and make it really dark. Now, it's not very good, but let's change this blend mode to something that needs to use fill as a communicator. One of those is my favorite blend mode in the world, hard mix. Most people think that this is the worst blend mode because look at it, it's hideous, and it is hideous. But fill, in this case, is going to alter the bone that is inside this layer. So as hard mix is right now, it's only showing us about 8 colors because hard mix at 100% really only shows us 8 colors, makes it really contrasty. But as we drop the fill, we drop the skeletal structure of that layer by also within that blend mode. And now there are more colors that are making the contrast in this image. And you can come up with something very beautiful with the hard mix blend mode. There's other blend modes in here that utilize this as well. One of them is linear light. And linear light, same thing. We drop the fill of this and you're going to see that it can actually make a pretty darn good looking image with this curve being what is controlling the contrast of that linear light blend mode that's on there. Typically, that's how you're going to see fill operating. Let's go ahead and delete that real quick. So that's kind of doing two things at once. I'm telling you how fill works in conjunction with the blend mode, but let's look at the blend mode as it is as a communicator with another different type of adjustment layer. So I'm going to grab a gradient map. One of my favorite ways to color grade an image is actually with the gradient map because it maps out our tones in our image to a specific color. In this case, we're telling it to make our darkest dark areas black and our brightest bright areas white. If I click on this though, I can change that to, let's say this one, and press OK. This is telling my darkest dark areas to become peach and my brightest bright areas to become blue. And it doesn't look very good, does it? Not at all. I don't think so. But there is a blend mode in here other than normal that's going to change the way this gradient map communicates with the rest of the image. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to change this to the color blend mode. Because what the color blend mode does is it says, okay, take these colors and apply it to all the underlying layers, but allow the luminance values or the tonal values of all those underlying layers to still shine through. So then if we mix that with something like opacity, look at that. We can actually make a very beautiful color grade on this image. Or we'll bring that opacity up, change this blend mode to something like hard mix. It's hideous, but drop that fill. And look at how now we're telling that gradient map to make our darkest dark areas this peach color and add contrast while you do it. Our whitest white areas this blue color and change the contrast while you do it. Because that's what the hard mix blend mode does. It's a contrast communicator. All of these here are contrast communicating blend modes. I'm not going to dive too much into the blend modes here because we're really just trying to talk about these systems that are available in these layers. Now let's just look at this real quick. We have this curves adjustment layer down here. We have this gradient map right here. This is our base image. Nothing too special. But with only 2 layers and understanding how those layers are communicating with the data that's below, I've been able to transform this image very quickly, extremely quickly. In the past, this used to take me multiple different layers because I would try to do this to the highlights, do that to the shadows, and I didn't understand how blend modes would communicate with my image. I didn't understand fill. I didn't understand opacity. And the one that I really didn't understand is my absolute favorite, and that's called blend if, or as we referred to it, the circulatory system. We want to block a certain area off. So let's just break this down really quick. With this gradient map, we have said, okay, I want you to communicate with this image using the hard mix blend mode. And then we took the fill or the bones of it and reduced the structure, the bone structure of that hard mix blend mode with that layer. So we don't have a whole lot actually going on with this layer and how it's communicating with the rest of the image. But we can even reduce it even more. So there's something called blend if. I'm going to double click on here. Blend if will get us into layer styles, just like we talked about with the Yosemite text. Let's say I want to block or protect the underlying layer's white areas from being affected by this gradient map. What I could do, I'll move this over here so we can see it better on these white areas, is I could move this over. And as I move this over, it's going to select certain tonal values that are at the 167 pixel mark all the way to the 255 pixel mark and protect them from being affected by our gradient map. It's very difficult to see at first. So this is my suggestion. Come over here to the color overlay and change the color overlay to a magenta color overlay. I definitely want magenta because magenta is a color that we don't find in our images all too often. And I'll press OK. Now when we come back up to these blending options and I move this over, you see that now we're telling it, protect the underlying layers or block, as if we're an artery, block the underlying layers highlights from being affected by this gradient map. And it's showing us that with this magenta color overlay. Now this magenta is just temporary, okay? From a workflow perspective, it's just temporary. It's not gonna be on our image. So as I move this over, we're now saying, okay, 128 is our median or our middle pixel value, okay? So and that's basically middle gray. So I want you to protect anything from the middle gray all the way to the whitest whites. And if we look at that, we can see it's very hard edged. So how do we fix that? Well, press Alt or Option, click on the slider and move it on over. Boom. Now I told you that I'm not a doctor, right? But look at how surgical we can be with blend if in our protection measures. You see how I did that? You like that? Was that a really corny joke? So as I move this over, we're now transitioning into our darkest dark areas. Now we can turn this color overlay off now because that was just to show us how to protect those mid-tone into highest highlight areas from being affected by this gradient map. We'll press OK. So now we have effectively gone into this gradient map. We've allowed it to apply itself to the image. We've lessened the skeletal structure of it with the fill. We have told it how to communicate by turning off certain synapses in the nervous system with hard mix. And now we've even gone into the circulatory system and blocked off certain things. So this layer is practically dead. It's almost dead, but it has just enough of effect to still be powerful in our workflow. And when we build up layers like this, we can be very surgical in our approach to how we process our photos. The one last function or system we need to talk about is the integumentary system or the skin system. So if I click on this layer mask here, let's say I want to block out this area right here from any effect from this gradient map. Well, I'll just start painting right here with black. And now I'm tapping into a whole nother system of this image, aren't I? Perfect. Look at that. I'm blocking out those areas and allowing them to shine through and give us some of that color that's underneath. So now let's break down the systems here. The only system we haven't touched in this one is the muscular system or the strength of this layer. I can do that by dropping this opacity to something like 80%. And now look at what this gradient map is doing. This layer from a clinical perspective should be dead, but look at how powerful it is on our photograph. We've got 17% fill, so the skeletal structure is pretty weak. We've reduced its overall strength to 80%, or the muscular system is on its way to failure. We used hard mix to tell this brain only to communicate with very specific places in the image. And then we even went into the circulatory system and we put some blockers in there so that blood flow couldn't go to the highlight areas of the image, all happening in one layer. And look at how effective that is. However, this layer gains a lot of its strength from the layer that's underneath it because it's leaning on it like a crutch. It's got its arm on its shoulder saying, hey dude, hold me up, I got nothing. So if we were to turn this curves adjustment layer off underneath it, look at that. We can barely tell that that gradient map is doing anything. But because this curves adjustment layer that's underneath it allows it to rest on it, the two of them combined are doing a great job together. And that's oftentimes what happens when we're weak. When we're weak, we need to rely on somebody else to help us out. Layers are the exact same way. Even though their personality traits might be different, these two are working together to make sure that this gradient map is still a shining star in this workflow. All right, so I told you I'm not a doctor, but I did wear this outfit throughout the entire video. So that's impressive, right? So while this might have been some type of cute analogy, this Blake's anatomy thing, it does a great job of explaining how layers are going to interact with the layers below by breaking them down into the systems that we have in our body, the functions that we have in our body. It opens your eyes to the potential of what even one single layer can do in your workflow. And just like human beings, it shows you that when a layer or a human is weak, it relies very heavily on the people around it to help it out. And that's exactly how layers work in our workflow. What you'll see in my images is I build an image from start to finish, as we're going to see in episode 3. Every layer in my workflow relies on the layer underneath it in order for it to work, which also helps build something called a non-destructive workflow. So I'm not building a bunch of pixel layers on top of each other. I'm utilizing the advantages of those layers as I'm working with my photos so I don't find myself at pixel layer stopping points. And the only way you can do that is by first understanding the layers that you have and those personality types of those layers and why they do what they do. And secondly, the systems that are available inside each one of those layers. In the next lesson coming at you, I'm going to give an analytical breakdown of every single layer in one of my finished images, so you can see exactly how I use those layers together to make one finished, beautiful, cohesive piece of art.